Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week are the anti-vaxxers making bizarre claims about the relationships between COVID-19 vaccines and prion diseases, the benefits of post-market surveillance of drugs, particularly as they relate to epilepsy and birth defects, improvements to kidney transplants in children leading to the removal of the need for lifelong immunosuppressant use, new living skin for robots, and the unusual prevalence of extra chromosomes, specifically sex chromosomes, in males. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the purported claims of a relationship between COVID-19 vaccines and Creutzfeldt-Jakob Disease. This is a form of prion disease and is more commonly known as mad cow disease. The name itself derives from one of the most famous outbreaks, which was in the UK. It occurred due to beef cattle in the UK developing a prion disease in the form of bovine spongiform encephalopathy. That's a specific kind of prion disease for cattle. Humans then acquired this, which became Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Fundamentally, you need to have some sort of exposure to the disease to be infected. This is why the entire argument from anti-vaxxers is fundamentally misinformation and insanity. It stems from a draft article that hasn't been published yet and isn't even in early access. The basis on which the entire argument relies is that those who have been diagnosed with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease were recently vaccinated. This doesn't mean that anyone who's vaccinated developed prion diseases, nor does it mean the prion diseases are in any way related to the vaccines. They try and then conflate this with a common region in the spike protein of COVID-19, particularly in the Delta variant, that has overlap with prion diseases. That is, it's a protein, and in fact, both are proteins. Most things in the human body that come from DNA become protein because that's how the body manages to communicate, create signals, and so on. The spike on the COVID-19 virus isn't anything different. The fact that we use either a synthetically made or an RNA version of that same particular spike means that you should be getting Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease from both infection with COVID-19, which you might describe as natural infection, and you can also acquire it from vaccines. There is no reason why you would only be getting it from vaccines only. There is no way for this to be that selective if it is the same spike protein responsible. The article we link you to also goes into another outbreak which some have suspected may be related to COVID-19, and this is a Canadian outbreak of a mysterious brain illness, something which occurred months before the COVID-19 outbreak did. So this is an issue of time being linear, not time being all timey-wimey like Doctor Who would make us think. You can't have an event that occurs afterwards cause something earlier. It's this kind of scaremongering and twisting of facts that can so often be a major sticking point, especially when it comes to people believing in unscrupulous, unreasonable, or simply incorrect things. This is where an article from Science-Based Medicine on the safety of CBD is useful. CBD, or cannabidiol, is the active ingredient in various products. Mostly we're talking about cannabis, but not the psychoactive component of cannabis. That's THC. This is the chemical that doesn't provide the high or other effect that you might consider recreational from cannabis. It's more focused on being a supplement. Supplements really are just unregulated medications, and the article goes into some more detail on that. In fact, it's something we've spoken about at length before, with various supplements, herbal remedies, and so on, having very little to control what they are, what they contain, and all sorts of other issues that have been demonstrated with the industry as a whole. CBD is slightly different. Primarily, it's because CBD has some evidence to support its use in very limited scenarios. In fact, it only has one recognized use as a prescribed drug. That is for epilepsy, under the drug name Epidiolex. It does have some evidence indicating a role as an antiemetic, but this has not yet been approved for any use as a prescription drug. This is where the problem of CBD as a herbal remedy, a supplement, or traditional use product comes in. None of these are ways you know what you're getting, how much you're getting, and more importantly, how much of what you're getting is going to be the active ingredient and how much of it is going to be adulterants, substitutes, and more. Keeping that in mind, it's worth considering that CBD, when used as an over-the-counter or easily purchased supplement, there is no regulation, there's no control, there's no discussion about how it might interact with other drugs that you're on, and some people will choose to use it as a alternative traditional therapy that is all natural, and therefore forego pharmaceutical treatments that are known to work and have been approved as a prescription treatment. This is where CBD gets even more complicated. Assuming you don't spurn prescription medication entirely while also taking CBD, there is a very good chance that you are going to have adverse drug events because of the interaction between CBD and other medications. This is then explained in more detail in the article and why there are concerns about the safety of it, but in terms of how it's regulated rather than what CBD itself is. This compares somewhat unfavorably to prescription medication in that nearly all prescription medication is monitored for aftermarket surveillance. That is, once a drug has been approved and is allowed to be sold, what happens with that drug? What side effects are reported? How often? Is there anything new? Are there deaths related to it? And more. This post-market surveillance is a very important element to nearly every medication out there, partially for safety, partially to allow companies to improve the product and take away some of the more significant side effects. In other cases, it lets them identify something that may not have shown up when they were conducting clinical trials. This is the case with valproic acid, a drug used to treat epilepsy and bipolar disorders. It appears to have a relationship with causing birth defects and developmental disorders. This is, of course, only a significant concern during pregnancy, but the reality is that it exists, and that means there is a fairly significant group of people who need to be concerned about it, need to know it's occurring, and need to make informed decisions. Knowing why it does this means those drug companies can do what we mentioned earlier and modify it and change it for future formulations to improve efficacy, take away the effects, thereby allowing for the problem at hand to go away. It would appear this medication has an effect on the cell cycle which prevents cells from dividing and proliferating, which, during fetal development, is incredibly important. One of the most significant timeframes that it has its effect is during the development of the neural tube. This is tissue that will become the brain and spinal cord. It only occurs between the 4th and 6th week of pregnancy, which means there's a very narrow window of time where this drug appears to have its most significant impact on fetal development. The mechanism underlying this is the alteration of the activity of a gene for something called B19ARF. This is meant to stop the development of certain cells once you reach adulthood, or more specifically at the end of embryonic development, so that brain development and spinal cord development can occur. By getting this gene to start working when it does, the cell proliferation cannot happen and you see the effects that we've mentioned. There are some caveats to everything we've described so far, and the biggest is going to be that they were using a mouse and organoid model to try and figure out what was happening here. And there are some issues around the translation of animal-based research to its relationship in humans, and the ability to develop an organoid model that is accurate enough and comprehensive enough to be able to then also be translated to humans. So this is a very strong indication, but it may or may not be the underlying cause and mechanism. The article in question goes into further details on other caveats to the study and further information on exactly what they were doing and how. There's also been a second study this week looking at the brain, but this time in relationship to changes derived from anorexia. Anorexia is an eating disorder in which somebody fundamentally refuses to eat, and as a result, without sufficient nutrition and calories, can both lose significant amounts of weight and become extremely ill. The study relied on brain scans of 1,648 females. 685 of these had anorexia. The participants were from 22 different locations, which means you do remove some of the issues around geography and a narrow area in which you may have some confounding factor. It makes their findings of a reduction in cortical thickness, reduction in subcortical volume, and cortical surface area more substantial than if they had simply focused on one region. The impact of this cannot be understated, but it also needs to be taken with some degree of salt despite being one of the largest studies of its kind. The reality is that it has an impact 2 to 4 times more than things like depression would. When you look at what has in particular been affected, this makes a lot of sense in some ways. The brain needs calories and it needs a certain amount of fat, or more specifically lipids, in order to be able to make the brain work properly. The calories, specifically glucose, are needed for neurons to work, and the lipids are needed for things like the myelin sheath around some of the neurons. This means that they can communicate more effectively with less disruption. Having the impact identified is a good start, and at the moment the researchers don't make any assumptions as to what exactly is causing it. They do speculate though, and these speculations are then backed up by evidence that things like cognitive behavioral therapy can reverse some of the changes that were observed. This means that with any luck, early interventions that target cognitive behavioral therapy processes and use them appropriately, and then following up with good nutrition, could help people to recover at least some of the function that was lost. Going from the clinical aspects of psychiatry to pediatrics and specifically organ transplants. One of the biggest challenges with organ transplants has always been having enough organs on hand and getting them to the right people who have been approved because they are following the right behaviors. Unfortunately, children fit into an odd area when it comes to this. They are, in some ways, ideal recipients, but they also then have a lifetime of immunosuppressants in order to be able to keep their organ in working order. The way this particular process worked was to take kidneys in particular, which are already in very high demand, and so losing one to organ rejection is a big blow, not just to the person who has now lost a kidney, but to someone else who might have been able to use it and not reject it. They're able to prevent rejection and in fact prevent the entire issue around immunosuppressant therapy by transplanting stem cells from the donor into the patient. This means that the immune system is being trained not to recognize the kidney as being foreign, since stem cells in the bone marrow will make immune cells that don't recognize it as being something different and non-self. The whole process involves removing all of the T and CD19 B cells. B cells are what make antibodies, and remember, what antibodies need to be made based on past exposure. T cells are what activate the immune system and in some ways directly attack cells that aren't meant to be there or are recognized as not being self. This could be cancer, bacteria, or, in this case, donated organs that have been transplanted. By removing these and putting the original donor's stem cells into the recipient, you completely remove the issue of the immune system being able to recognize the organ as foreign. This is nowhere near as bad as, for example, dealing with leukemia, where all of the bone marrow is removed through ablative radiation. Instead, only those cells are targeted, and this means cell recovery can occur between 60 and 90 days later, which means there is a much narrower window in which the immune system is a concern and goes back to otherwise full and normal function. The transplants themselves have been successful, and all recipients have had theirs for between at least 22 and up to 34 months. This means that the evidence that it's removed the need for any kind of immunosuppressant therapy is very strong, as after 3 years there should have been some kind of complication if that was going to occur. While focusing on children is good, they're also not the biggest pool of people that you need to worry about. In the case of kidneys, it's in fact much older individuals. Overall though, kidney disease and the need to replace kidneys with transplants is a much smaller group than others. The biggest organ you would have to worry about is going to be the heart and lungs. Little can be done about the lungs, but the heart, on the other hand, does have research this week indicating that there might be a way to substantially improve outcomes. It's the development of a biodegradable gel that's meant to help new tissue regrow in the heart after a heart attack. A heart attack is, more appropriately, cardiac ischemia. That is, where blood flow to the heart is blocked or stopped for a time due to, say, a blood clot or something else. At that time, there's a lack of oxygen, otherwise known as hypoxia, leading to tissue death, and this tissue death, since it's the heart, is largely muscle. That prevents the heart from contracting. Cardiac muscle does not grow back. It doesn't really matter what happens at this stage. Researchers have not found a way to make cardiac muscles grow back after they have died. This means you have permanent loss of those particular cells in the heart, which means the heart can no longer beat as effectively. This is where the research is so very important. A tiny fraction of cells from past research stayed where they were ejected into the beating heart and then replaced damaged cells. This is not going to work very well, and why the gel is so important. The gel will keep stem cells in place and ensure that they can replace cardiac muscle effectively, thereby preventing gradual but sure heart failure. The evidence at this stage is very preliminary, and that's an important note. This is fundamentally just a petri dish experiment showing that you can use the gel and program stem cells to create new cardiac muscle cells. Going from cells in a dish to cells that are used in a somewhat creepy manner, the creation of skin. This does sound very much like a sci-fi discovery. The design for this is surprisingly similar to human skin. It's a collagen layer which had human dermal fibroblasts or cells within it. Over this was a dermal layer that had keratinocytes within it. These are the skin cells that you'd be familiar with on the outside of your body. Together, this created something relatively similar to what is your normal human skin, formed around a robotic hand. The advantages to the processes they used is that it's not molded or shaped, rather it grows around the robotic digits. From this, it was able to create a moisture barrier, an electrical barrier. It was able to provide resistance to external materials and repair itself. The repairing was slightly more difficult though, as it involved the use of collagen patches. This last element is a bit more important than the others since it was comparatively fragile. Consider what your skin puts up with on a daily basis. It's able to deal with a lot of mistreatment. Despite what you may view of the world, it's not exactly a hospitable place to the human body at all times and in all ways. whether that's sunlight and UV radiation, cold, the constant things you do with your fingers. All of this puts wear and tear on those cells. And this is one reason why the somewhat weaker synthetic skin being created here is flawed, but also very noteworthy as being a strong beginning. The next stages of development are going to be much more difficult. One of the first things they're going to have to deal with is how to make it more resistant to environmental forces and be able to recover better. The second is to make it more independent. At present, it relies heavily on being in a controlled environment where it can be provided with nutrition and have waste removed while staying moist. This is something that the human body deals with by having a blood supply for your skin. Going from research into robots into research into genetics, and a surprising observation when it comes to having extra sex chromosomes. There are many diseases where having an extra X chromosome is the underlying cause. When this happens, there are many problems that come up. Most often you have developmental disorders if survival even happens in utero. There's always fertility-related problems, and there can often be many complications in development if someone survives their initial birth. Going forwards into adolescence and beyond, their lives are generally drastically shortened by comparison to someone with either an XX or XY chromosome set. This is where the observation that many more men than initially thought may have more chromosomes than thought initially, specifically an extra X or an extra Y. The study relied on 207,000 men who provided information to the UK Biobank. Of these, 213 had an extra X chromosome, and 143 had an extra Y chromosome. That's approximately 1 in 500. Compared with females who have similar chromosomal abnormalities, notably having an extra X chromosome, there were very few reported effects of carrying these extra chromosomes. Less than 1% of the XYY and 23% of the XXY men reported any kind of diagnosis in relation to genetic and specifically chromosomal abnormalities. The researchers did note that among those males with an extra X chromosome, they exhibited many of the same symptoms that females with extra X chromosomes had as well, particularly around fertility. The final piece of medical news we have for you this week is a weird bit of news coming out of America, and something you may have already heard of. It's the decision by a court to uphold an arbitration decision, and then the appeals court to reinforce that upholding of the decision for $5.2 million. The $5.2 million was an award given to a woman who contracted human papillomavirus whilst having sex in a car. The damages are to be paid by the insurance company, as the insurance policy has a section that reads, covering injuries that come out of the ownership, maintenance, or use of the vehicle. Technically, this is a vehicle-related activity. However, it's not a vehicle-related activity that the policy was probably intended to cover. Secondary to that is that the arbitrator awarded her that much money as the man who infected her was considered liable because they did not disclose their infected status while they were also having sex in the car. This means that the arbitrator views it as directly causing or directly contributed to the cause of contracting the human papillomavirus. Geico, which is the insurer, has argued against it, saying that since their policy wasn't intended to cover this and that it was not in line with laws and so on, that it shouldn't have to pay out. The problem is they've already lost at the arbitration, the initial court hearing level, and the appeals court. It's unlikely that they're going to be able to find a way out of this decision at present, which means there's very likely to be a slew of changes to policies, if not now, in the very near future, and for anybody looking to change their policy, soon or renew it, you're likely to find that this is something that has been included. Other somewhat hyperbolic news this week is coming out of Google. Well, more accurately, coming out of a software engineer who is supposedly leaking information. The Google engineer claims that they've created an AI that they believe has become sentient. They have now been put on administrative leave after sharing this information, since they do have a contract that says they're not to do so. They have done it, arguing that people need to know about this. This, on the other hand, has had a lot of pushback from both Google and other experts, saying that it doesn't seem likely at present that the artificial intelligence called LaMDA has actually gained sentience. The Google engineer called Blake Lemon has claimed that after talking with the AI for an extended period, they believe that only something that was sentient could be having the responses that it does. The problem for that, and this is perhaps one of the most immediate things that should have been tested, is have they conducted a Turing test? That is, the ability to identify what is a human and what is an AI. This is the first hurdle that all AI need to pass in order to be considered sentient, and it doesn't seem like this particular test has been mentioned in any articles so far. The AI spoke about things like fear, what it wants in life, and whether or not it wants to interact and for others to know about itself. The important thing about LaMDA is that it is intended to be a language-specific AI. LaMDA itself stands for Language Model for Dialogue Applications. It takes data from millions, if not billions and trillions of conversations, and tries to understand the context, the application, and the content of these conversations. It's then able to, for lack of a better word, regurgitate this in a way that makes sense. This means that for any given input, it can either find or theoretically create an appropriate output. This means a question will get an answer. A conversation will be continued by the AI because that is what it's intended to do. At this stage, it's unlikely we're going to get much more detail on exactly what the AI is, how it stands, and if they are conducting any more in-depth analyses, as Google seems to have quite happily established its position and doesn't seem likely to shift anytime soon. The final piece of news we have for you this week is regarding China's FAST telescope and the, again, somewhat hyperbolic claims that they may have discovered aliens. Again, this is based on taking some very fundamental information and attributing to it more meaning than might be there. The telescope has picked up a transmission, and that transmission could be from alien technology. It could be background noise, or if we use the joke from Big Bang Theory, somebody turning on a microwave just to screw with them. That is why this initial claim is hyperbolic. We don't have any of the proof that it's anything more than a signal that has been picked up. That's what the telescope is intended to do, so it's doing its job. We just don't know if that signal is anything more than what we've already mentioned, with examples as simple as background noise of the universe. The reason we have to be very careful with this is that this giant telescope is properly called the 500-meter aperture spherical telescope, otherwise given the abbreviation of FAST. It is the largest and also most sensitive telescope on Earth. It is arguably the largest until the square kilometer array is finished being built. But that is multiple individual receptors. This is the single largest dish-based radio telescope in the world. That also means it is perhaps the most sensitive. And being so sensitive, it can pick up a lot of things that would otherwise go unnoticed. Unfortunately, this initial reporting is likely to be long forgotten when the actual reality comes to light. That could be possibly a year or more down the track from now, and that's because it takes that long to verify and analyze the content. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.